Welcome to this program on the future workplace ADR. For those of you who were not able to attend the prior session on diversity, it was an extremely valuable conversation about the barriers to diversity in our field and some of the proposed solutions to improving the diversity, particularly of minorities and females in the profession. And that session has been recorded and will be available to you in the future. It was mentioned in the first session that this entire series is dedicated to a friend of many of ours who was a former president of LIRA, a mentor to literally hundreds, and someone who has encouraged us to enter this field of mediation and arbitration. And David can't join us today, but we certainly dedicate this to him. And at this point, we're also honoring the memory of a very close friend of many of us, Arbitrator Marcia Greenberg from the Boston area, who also encouraged and was a role model for literally hundreds of people in the course of her career. The rules of the road are the same as in the first session. This is a conversational mode. You should stay muted. And because of the volume of people, we're proposing that there probably won't be time. There may be at the end for verbal questions, but you place most of your questions into chat. We have a chat monitor. Thank you, Janet Gilman from Oregon. So we're asking that you direct your questions to her in the chat. Because of the anticipated volumes, we're sort of discouraging crosstalk, which is way to go, or thank you, or wonderful. But it's important that Janet receive all of your questions, which we strongly encourage today. So the purpose of this session is to build on the first session on diversity, but to more broadly discuss the future of developing workplace neutrals. And we've identified 5 different themes or 5 different questions that will shape that conversation. But the theme of this program is building the next generation of workplace neutrals. And there's a few of us on this call, like myself, that are aging and look forward to meeting and mentoring the next generation. The panelists have significant qualifications in this area. They're academics, they are neutrals, and they currently develop ADR talent along the way. And we're generally referring to the future of workplace ADR is about 10 years from now. So our first panelist is going to be Harry Katz, who, as you see, is a professor at ILR, director of the renowned Scheinman Institute, former president of LIRA, this organization, and most importantly to me, president-elect of the International LIRA. That's a huge compliment, Harry, and thank you for joining us. Our next panelist is Professor Rachel Godgin from the World Institute at Creighton. I've been there and taught a few times. She is not only a professor, but also a mediator and an arbitrator of labor and employment litigation. So Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. And myself, a neutral from Arizona. So at this point, we're going to engage you. We're going to ask that you think for a second about one word or a phrase that describes this whole theme of developing the next generation of neutrals, and direct your answer to Janet. And just to give you a couple ideas, one word might be difficult. One word might be impossible. One word might be you need a second income. There's a lot of barriers. I would argue that probably no more than 20% of the people who come to my office who want to be neutrals make it. So why? And that's one of the purposes of this discussion. Why is it so difficult to be a successful neutral in this field? So if you could, in the next few minutes, direct your answers, if you have them, to Janet, and then later, maybe a half hour from now, we're going to ask Janet to come back and summarize those. So the first question that we're turning to Harry to kick off will be this: what will be the changing demographics of the labor force? And just one little slide. This is amazing. 8 months ago, 5% of the American workforce was remote. Over the summer, it was 50%. And that's just one answer to the question. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Harry kick this off.
Thanks, Dick. Thanks for your introduction, and also for all your work in arranging this session. I also thank Emily, Bernadette, Markov, and others that have helped make this session and this series happen. So in terms of the demographics of the workforce, clearly the workforce is becoming more diverse. A lot of the discussion in the previous panel focused on how the profession could more closely reflect the diversity in the workforce. I won't dwell on that. I'm going to shift and talk to the question about how the nature of work is changing. And there I'll mention a few things which I bet you would have raised yourself if you were asked to talk on this topic. And then I'll talk about a few factors and trends that may not be as obvious. One is, it's clear that the non-union sector and the use of dispute resolution, whether that be ADR or other dispute resolution techniques, is becoming ever more important and heightened in the non-union setting, in part because of the growth of employment arbitration. Remember, Alex Colvin and others' research shows that more than 50% of non-union employees are now covered by some sort of employment arbitration procedure. Obviously, that is much larger than the share of the workforce in the union sector, which in the private sector now only a little bit more than 6.5% of the workforce is represented by unions. Larger in the public sector. That number 6.5 is in the private sector. Other changes, again, you probably would have guessed this, is there's less structured work. There's more contingent work. There's more work that's computer mediated. And as Dick has just highlighted in the slide, there's more remote work. We'll come back later in the session and talk about how the work of dispute resolvers themselves is changing given the use of virtual techniques. We'll talk about that explicitly, but for now, we just want to mention that the nature of work is becoming more virtual, more homework, and that's clearly important. Now, a couple changes that you might not have thought of that I think are also really important is the fact that we have a growth already, and I think it's going to increase, in collective representation forms that don't necessarily involve unions and collective bargaining. In one way or another, forms of what's sometimes referred to as NGOs, ranging from something like the Immokalee Coalition, helping those that pick and harvest tomatoes to get representation, Taxi Driver Alliance, Home Worker Alliance, many organizations, immigrant rights groups, work centers. I already see, and I think it's going to grow, that dispute resolution professionals are going to become involved in the disputes that involve those various forms of collective representation that don't involve unions and are not necessarily involving employment arbitration. I mean, mediation or even some arbitration that's occurring because of those new forums representing employee rights and interests. They're doing so in part because of the diversification in the work, and they're obviously also becoming more important because of the limited coverage of collective bargaining in the private sector. As we all know, that doesn't eliminate by any means conflict, so those conflicts are being coalesced through organizations that take these less traditional forms. You also may be thinking about the fact that we see, I think this is a good thing on many fronts, the growth of ADR and other forms of dispute resolution involving non-workplace disputes. Just keep that in mind, that we're focusing particularly in this session about workplace issues, but there's already underway the use, obviously, of arbitration, mediation, and commercial, international, environmental, community, and I and many others expect that to grow. And then the last thing I'll mention is really something that really I understood more clearly when I stepped out of the classroom and became an administrator, which I did for 10 years as Dean of ILR and as interim provost of Cornell. And it's something I talk to my students about all the time. And that is that in those roles as an administrator, not because Cornell had an unusual amount of conflict, but because of the nature of all organizations, I spent more than 50% of my time negotiating or mediating. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think that's what happens in virtually all organizations. And I think there's a desperate need for greater use of what you all do in resolving conflicts through more informal means in organizations, and also sometimes through more formal means, such as through an ombuds role. And basically, I think dispute resolution can and already is broadening its focus. And let me stop at that, pass it back to Dick.
Rachel, I'm not sure if you had any other comment. I know I'm putting you on the spot here. Any follow-up to Harry's observations?
No, I think those were spot on.
It's absolutely fascinating that there are so many worker collective organizations that are not under formal collective bargaining, which raises many questions. Okay, excellent, Harry. So the next theme of this conversation is the changing demographics of who's entering the field as neutrals and their paths of entry. And these are just a few observations about how people have either historically or more recently entered this field. So Rachel.
Sure. I think a lot of those points that you had on the slide will continue to be the points where neutrals are entering their career. So traditionally you have graduate students of ADR who have a master's in an ADR degree. They'll come out, often get work in an organization, or begin perhaps with mediation or conciliation facilitation as some of their first work. And it's very accessible at that point. I think that will probably continue. To build on what Harry said earlier, I think you're seeing an interest in some organizations in earlier dispute resolution, less formal, so that you don't necessarily need to get to a formal mediation or to an arbitration, but really to resolve those disputes early on. I agree, as a former academic dean, a huge amount of time is spent mediating disputes that arise organically. So I think the need for that earlier dispute resolution in dispute resolution design of systems will show up. So a greater opportunity for dispute resolution there. As we take a look at another entry point, a lot of times folks in law schools, other professional schools, or other kinds of skills will go out after graduation. They'll practice in their area, whether that's law or medicine or something in the health fields, which is an area where we will be seeing, it's projected to have a lot of new jobs in the next decade. And so those folks will go out, I think, hone the skill for which they're trained, and then at a mid-career move, come back in as an entry point to being a neutral, and begin their mediation or their arbitration career there. And again, I think that's going to be a continued need, a continued entry point based on the skills, the technical or professional skills that they bring to bear. And then finally, you do see some folks later in the career, perhaps at retirement time, at that point pivot and begin their neutral career. I think that will continue, possibly expand. One of the projections for the workforce in the next decade is that we'll have a greater number of older workers. So there may be a greater availability of work on that end, as well as an expansion to earlier dispute resolution.
So Rachel, one obvious question, in 10 years, will you have to be a lawyer?
I don't think so, but I'll disclose my bias. I'm not sure you have to be a lawyer today to be a neutral. I think that sometimes, depending on the complexity of the issue, there might be a bias on some folks to think you need a lawyer for that. But I think there are non-lawyers who bring their own specialties, whether that's in construction or health law, or a number of these collective organizations, right, where you might even be less likely to see a lawyer involvement. So I don't think so, but I also recognize that I probably don't speak for everyone on that issue. I'd be interested in hearing, Harry, what you have to say on that.
Well, I'm always proud to say that I'm not a lawyer when I'm on panels or other matters involving dispute resolution, and I'm commonly surrounded by lawyers, whether they're advocates or other members of the panel. But I agree completely with what Rachel just said, is you don't need to be a lawyer now. I mean, it doesn't hurt you, but it's not necessary. I think at times it gets overemphasized as a requirement. Some people think, oh, I've got to get in somewhere. I've got to, they start out being a different role, you know, often whether you're in a union or management and you didn't get a law degree. Do you have to have a law degree and you have to get one to be an effective neutral? I don't think so. Again, it doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't do as much for you as you might think.
And I think a lot of those same characteristics that parties look for when they're selecting a neutral, you're going to find those in lawyers and non-lawyers, right? You're looking for someone who can demonstrate solid judgment, the ability to analyze a problem, the ability to run a hearing well, right? Be timely in the follow-up of the award. You know, there's nothing about those skills that necessarily is lawyer-only territory.
So Rachel, do you expect that you still need to have so-called gray hair to be an arbitrator before you'll be hired?
Well, sadly for me, since I don't have gray hair, or maybe we'll be too vain to ever go that route. I think that there's something to be said for that, and I think parties are still looking for some amount of experience, right? And so some expertise, knowledge of a field, knowledge of the kind of workplace. They're looking for someone who understands the kind of dispute they're going to put in front of them. I think it will still start small, right? They're not going to give you the big contract case first out. They're going to give you a small discipline case, try you out to see how you're doing, and go from there.
30 years ago, I remember the days when you did not need subject matter expertise. I pine for those days, but I'm afraid that they're over.
Yeah, I think that parties increasingly, you know, are most comfortable with someone who understands their workforce, their issue. And so I think in that regard, having some experience with their workplace makes them more comfortable with choosing you as a neutral. What do you think, Harry?
So yeah, I was just going to chime in and say, I think what you both said is absolutely right, but I'd also note that what I've observed is people often accumulate their experience when they're starting out outside the workplace. They get involved in the community, environmental, or some other kind of dispute, build up their skills, and then that assists them. It doesn't solve all the issues Rachel's correctly identifying in terms of having experience with workplace matters or contractual matters, but you can also just get started. And also you may find that you want to stop at that kind of work. You don't have to necessarily go and do workplace disputes. And I'd also say, as I was just mentioning, and Dick was also building upon, the growth of these other forms of collective action are going to be an arena where you could, I think, more easily get started and develop your skills, and maybe also, fully play out your role because of their increasing importance. Whereas in the past, the notion was, oh, I had to do collective bargaining disputes, and then, okay, maybe I'll go out and do employment arbitration. Maybe some of the more interesting issues of the day are going to start getting settled and addressed in these new forms of organization. It's an arena that'll have, I think, a bit more open opportunity.
Sure. So to summarize your comments, Rachel, sounds like there's not going to be a huge change in 10 years in terms of how people enter this profession.
Right.
And most of them are mid-career, I could say, not all of them. And the parties who select you as a mediator arbitrator do expect some subject matter expertise.
I think that's the way it is, and probably will continue. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Our next step along this conversation is to go back to Janet. And Janet, can you share what people have said? And you can comment, Janet.
Yeah, I think a lot of these were repeated, so I tried to just quickly group them. There was a real theme about, passing the torch. It's really the responsibility of the experience through mentorship, development, this sense of pipeline, our experience being shared with younger or more junior folks coming into the field. Going to the bottom, there was some comments just about, the challenge. It's exciting. There's hope around it. And, I think ambitious suggests that, there's a lot of work, and, a lot of work has been happening around this. So it's a continuation of the effort. This set here, the labor relations field is dwindling. And then I thought this was an interesting comment, a certain amount of selfishness. I guess self-preservation. I'm not exactly sure what that person was getting at, but that it is a necessary task for our field and a burden on all of us. And then, of course, in the middle here, opportunities, creating access, thinking in terms of outcomes. So it's kind of a nice spread, given the challenge of one word or phrase.
Sure. Harry or Rachel, any observations?
Very interesting.
Yes, it is interesting. Some of those are sort of acknowledgements of how I think the process works now. Some I think I have to give it a little more thought to.
We're going to be talking about mentorship in a few minutes. My only observation about the first one, which probably most of us feel so strongly about, that there is an ethical obligation. I find that is not accepted by the part-time neutrals. It is accepted by full-time neutrals. It's much less accepted by part-time neutrals for a variety of reasons, I suppose, including they have a full-time job. That is not being neutral. But for those of us in this field, I think there's a very strong ethical obligation to worry about this problem. Wonderful. Thank you, Janet. So I'm going to be leading the next conversation about the competencies that will be required. And you've already heard my observation, and you may or may not agree that only 20% of the people who come into my office, and it's a constant stream, make it. I don't keep track of them. I'm not sure exactly if they give up, or if they tried, or they found something else. But this is a pretty traditional map of what the competencies are to be a successful neutral. Most of the people that come into my office think that the first one is the most important, and it's not. that you have to have the essential skills, of course. And you gain those through a variety of ways, including training, including just doing it, as Harry has said. My sense is that over the next 10 years, there'll be much greater emphasis on settlement skills as opposed to just doing an award or using one tool in your toolkit. In the next 10 years, many of us believe that the tech competencies are going to be more important. I would say that they didn't exist. You know, I've been doing Zoom at Cornell for several years and always viewed it as this little niche product. You know, you only used it when you did competitions. You never used it at any other time other than competitions. And now I have 4 calls today. Social media has many elements, but that's an increasingly important part of the competencies of what it takes to be successful. But the one that I want to focus on, because it's really one of my expertise, is the business part of it. My guess is that 80% of neutrals wannabes don't make it because of this one. They don't completely comprehend how they're selected, the idea of branding and marketing, and the need to shape their image as a problem solver, not just as perhaps an arbitrator or a mediator. And there's a couple more that I'll add verbally based on the last session and this one. One, of course, is respect in the profession, and that's part of your branding. Branding is your self-image, and that requires respect. And the other one that was voiced earlier in the earlier session is networking. If you're not a good networker, it is very difficult to make it in this profession. My last comment before I turn it over to the others is that every month I meet with these retired judges and they whine to me, "Oh, why don't I have any work? Why doesn't anybody select me?" And I said, "Well, have you published anything? Are you speaking? Are you building your market?" "Oh, no, that's beneath me. I don't want to do anything that would make me a business. I'm a retired judge." And I'm just using that as an example. But you could argue that that suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to be selected hundreds of times, like those of us on this call, because we're viewed as acceptable. Harry, you want to start off?
Yeah, the thing I want to talk a little bit about and mention is that there are ways to get trained, develop your skills. Obviously, networking is important, but so is skill development and practice. And I want to mention that the Scheinman Institute at ILR, with Dick's help, has more and more programs, courses, mechanisms for people who want to enter or further develop their skills. And many of those are now provided virtually. Some are purely virtual. Others are a combination, what we call blended, where some of it's virtual, some of it's in person, or some of it is even asynchronous, and then some of it is interactive virtual, and then some of it is in person. And there's just a lot more coming on stream at the Scheinman Institute, but also with other programs. And I'd encourage you to check those out. It's a way that technology is making it easier to develop the skills and the experience that you need to both enter and further expand your role in this field.
Absolutely. Rachel? And I've just moved ahead because I think Harry got into his next subject.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that there certainly are places that offer that training, and folks should be taking advantage of it. The Warner Institute is in the process of expanding its offerings in that area. As we talk about the virtual learning, and we think about that as the tool we use as neutrals, I think certainly we need to develop a competency there. I don't necessarily see online dispute resolution as the only way that disputes will be resolved moving forward. I think it certainly takes up some of the space. We're seeing an increase in online dispute resolution, particularly that's court related now, and we may see some expansion of that in the workplace. But I still think, and I'd be interested in your experiences as well, you know, even as tech savvy as our students may be, we teach synchronously online, we teach asynchronously online, we teach in person, we have some hybrid classes as well. There are some students, and I think this is true of people generally, who prefer that online touch. That's where they are most comfortable. And I don't mean touch like within 6 feet of social distancing. I just mean that they express themselves best when they are in person, even with masking and social distancing. So I think that as we take a look at the competencies we'll need moving forward, there's certainly the need to develop an online competency, but I think there needs to be a recognition that that isn't going, in my estimation, in 10 years, that's not going to be a wholesale replacement for having in-person skills.
So can I talk as well? I think that's a good point by Rachel. I conducted interviews with 6 active conflict resolvers, I call them, Marty Scheinman himself, Sarah Espinoza, who was on the earlier session. I asked her about her role as an ombudsperson. Marty obviously is active, neutral, and arbitrator. I asked Gwen Wilcox, a union advocate, Ken Kirshner, a management side advocate, and then a plaintiff side advocate, Doug Wigdor, on this very question of how are they using virtual technology to be a conflict resolver, and what do they think is going to happen in the future? And quickly, you can look at those, by the way, those are up on the ILR Scheinman Institute website. They were all surprised at how well it's gone. Using Zoom, as Dick's mentioned, and Rachel too, I too was a teacher in classes this past semester. I was amazed actually how well it went compared to my fears. They thought that there would be a lot of use of Zoom continuing, even for negotiations, as well as mediation, and even for arbitration, less so for court appearances. But as Rachel said, not by any means exclusive, and it remains to be seen exactly what the mix will be. But they did all think that there was going to be much more virtual dispute resolution. Now, let me just throw out one little worry I have, which might be a fear that because of that, that means the senior, well-experienced arbitrators and neutrals may have even more business. Their reluctance to travel, or the fact that people getting started could get a start by being willing to travel to far-off places. Well, now you don't have to travel to hold a hearing, and I worry. I think we're going to have to think about that and make sure that doesn't happen, that the use of virtual technology doesn't further concentrate the field. Somebody also has a comment, I got to add it in. I hold the Jack Shankman chair. Jack was a wonderful labor leader, and that's the chair that I hold at ILR. But I direct an institute named after Marty Scheinman, Marty and Lori Scheinman. Scheinman and Shankman are 2 different last names, and I want to respect both of them and not confuse them. And certainly, I didn't mean in any way to downplay the importance that Jack Shankman played in the American labor movement. Thanks.
So to wrap up this question, there were 2 other words that we've not mentioned. One is a toolkit. My recommendation is that emerging neutrals need a broad toolkit. It's no longer going to be easy to break into this field if you just do one thing. You need to have broader skills. And secondly, a business plan. Every judge that comes to my office wanting work tells me that they do not have a business plan. They've not thought it through. And to me, that's essential. Okay, Harry, have we pretty much covered this? And Rachel?
Yeah, I'm just curious if Rachel had further thought, because I've talked about it, and she got some words into it. Again, I think virtual is going to change the nature of work. We were talking earlier how it's going to change the kind of issues. There's issues about, how do you discipline employees? How do you monitor them? What form does collective action take? when people are working more at home. And then it obviously has implications just for the direct work of dispute resolvers. How do you work with this, hopefully soon, with the possibility of in-person interaction, but also the possibility of virtual interaction. And I think it remains to be seen exactly what the mix is, but I bet it's going to be a mix.
Yeah, I think it will be a mix, and certainly there are places where having online dispute resolution expands the process, right? Makes it available to some folks who may not otherwise have had that available. But I don't see it as completely replacing. I agree with you there.
Right. Okay, our last theme has to do with mentoring. Is it important?
Yeah.
Is everyone being mentored? Rachel?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. Either that you seek out a mentor if you're at that stage of your career, to figure out, maybe as Dick's pointed out, maybe you didn't have a business plan and that was important, or maybe there are networking opportunities and, how do you tap into those? But I also think that, even as you start, as you're gaining your own experience, reach out to people who are your peers, because maybe there's an opportunity that comes along, and it's not the right opportunity for you, but you can certainly start building that opportunity for your peer by handing that off. So I would think of mentoring in the broadest sense, not just sort of more experience to less experience, but I think that across the cohort, wherever you are, that within your cohort, that you are thinking of others if something comes your way and it's just not something that works for you, or maybe you know someone who has experience that parties are looking for, and you can make a recommendation for them as well. So I guess that would go against the selfishness word I heard earlier. I think you can still collaborate at certain places.
I would just argue that I've got at least 3 mentors, one for labor arbitration, one for employment arbitration, and one for facilitation or interest-based bargaining. And I've done this 22 years. I still call them. After 22 years, I still need advice from someone who's done it longer than I, or has a greater niche skill. Harry, anything else?
No, you've all said it well. I just emphasize, even in my own experience, going from being a pure faculty member without much of any administrative experience to suddenly being a dean and then a provost, I did just what Dick just said. I looked for mentors. It makes a lot of sense. If you're going to transition into a career as a neutral, and very few people go right out into being a neutral, as Rachel pointed out, you're going to have a transition moment. It's ever more important in that moment to rely on mentors. I, by the way, got a lot of really helpful advice from the former deans of the ILR school, Bob McCursey, Dave Lipsky, Ed Lawler, and others. And it just has real parallels. Just think about everyday life. You learn so much from mentors. That's certainly going to be the case if you are pursuing a transition into a neutral career.
And my personal opinion is that full-time neutrals are committed to this. Part-time neutrals are less committed to mentoring others for a variety of reasons. So we've used up our substantive time, and now we're going to go back to Janet, our wonderful chat moderator, and see what kind of questions we might want to answer.
Sure. Well, just working on this mentorship, people I think are doing a lot of listening because there's actually not a lot of chat going on. But on the mentorship question, so the person who put selfishness in on the one-word description elaborated and said that older, more experienced arbitrators are often territorial and selfish, unwilling to open a very close profession up to others. And then interestingly, someone else then said, but retired arbitrator, and I don't think they were reacting to each other here. These were just separate. Retired arbitrators can be good mentors. They do not see the new people as competitors. They can help by giving a helpful roadmap. So maybe it's just, you've talked about this a little bit, but who are the mentors? Who's sort of ideally set up to do this work could be something to talk about.
I think part of that, I'll take a first crack at it. I think part of establishing that mentor relationship is finding the right match. So not every arbitrator or mediator is necessarily going to be a fit with the person who's seeking a mentor. So part of that, I think, is just a selection process of what it is, individually you're looking for from a mentor. Sometimes it seems like it would be a fit, but it's in the relationship, it just doesn't really work out. So I'd encourage you, if the first person you reached out to didn't fit, right, wasn't a fit, I keep looking, because I really do think there are a wide range of mediators and arbitrators who are not retired, but who are certainly willing to help others. So I'd say keep at it. And then I think maybe Dick or Harry said, keep in mind that you might, it could be several, right? You don't necessarily just stop at one. You might have mentors for different reasons.
Someone raised an interesting question related to that. Sorry, Janet. About
no, go ahead.
How do you get a mentor in this a world of virtual interaction? Well, hopefully the pandemic will end not too long and we'll be able to have in person. But I would also say it's another thing to develop, is the skill and ability to have mentoring, social and other interactions virtually. It's just part of our new world, and some people are really good at it, and others need to learn and develop that as a skill. I mean, I had to learn how to talk with my students who had questions, and needed career advice through a Zoom call. It certainly feels different than if they're sitting right across from me in my office. And I think we all have to find ways to adjust, because the virtual communication is going to expand. As Rachel's pointed out, it's not going to take over everything. Let's not exaggerate and oversimplify, but it's certainly going to expand, including, as the person's questions imply, including developing and interacting with mentors.
So the virtual environment poses some specific challenges. There are quite a few people here who are just interested generally in how to find a mentor. Can you cite some specific places or opportunities where you would direct somebody looking to make a connection?
Most obvious is your local LIRA chapter. As you may know, LIRA has a large national organization, of which Harry was the president, but also has a very active local. In fact, there's other presidents I see on the screen. Has a very local chapter process, and those chapters constitute of a wide variety of people. And Bonnie, I don't know if you'd like to say something. You know a lot about that subject. You're still muted.
She may be blocked.
You
good.
can tell
Bonnie,
I'm one
go
of the
ahead.
troglodytes here in terms of getting this Zoom stuff straight. Yeah, the local chapters are very active, and even in this time of Zoom, most of them have picked up having regular meetings by Zoom. When Harry was president and when I was, we made an effort to get around to the chapters, which was possible at that time, and really encouraged both labor management and neutrals and academics all to be involved and all to help with the mentoring. If you can get to the meetings, and when you have the arbitration development panels and all, go up to the arbitrators afterwards and just start working the group in terms of lunches or opportunities to meet and talk and see who fits. I had a number of mentors as I was starting out my arbitration practice. And it was really helpful to me because we all have different skill sets and we hold hearings in different ways. And so it's good as a young, whether young or middle-aged, but as a new person coming in, it's good to see how a number of people operate. Thanks, Dick.
There's another organization called the Association for Conflict Resolution. They also have chapters in every major city. So they would absolutely be a source of networking as well.
Yeah, and a number of our LYRA people have been very active in ACR and the predecessor Spider. So you'll find a lot of experience there. Thanks.
So we only have 2 minutes left, and we can either take more questions or ask the panelists for their summary comments. Janet, I'm looking at some of the questions.
Yeah, I think you've answered a lot of them along the way. Someone did have a question about a business plan. I don't know if you want to get that specific at the end here in closing.
Well, I'll just say that a business plan has about 10 different elements that helps the emerging neutral, the new neutral, decide numerous issues in terms of what is going to be their brand or image, what's going to be their corporate structure, how are they going to market themselves, what's their fee structure. It's a wonderful opportunity to be forced to think through all these essential questions.
Mm-hmm.
So just to summarize, Harry, you want to go first? Anything?
Well, I'd just add that that the institutes and the programs that exist in universities, some in law schools, but some like ILR not affiliated with law schools. You know, as Rachel was mentioning, the program she's a part of, I'm a part of the ILR school. We not only have these training programs, but we have mechanisms for people to interact, to find a mentor, to practice, to get feedback. So look to those as well. I mean, Dick's pointing out LYRA has more than 50 chapters. If you need to find out your local or regional chapter, contact Emily or Bernadette. They can connect you in. So LYRA is really valuable. Other associations can help. And then also look at the institutes and academic programs, again, that have a conflict resolution focus. Not all schools obviously have a conflict resolution focus, but there are some that do, and they can be a resource. I'll stop at that. Thanks.
Rachel?
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think one of the points that was made earlier that's really an important one is, you know, to be that neutral, it's a lot of networking. It's a lot of going out there and talking to a lot of people. Some of those conversations will be successful, but some of them may not be. So I think, you know, there's a fair amount of grit and stick to it attitude that needs to happen if it's something that you want to pursue successfully. So don't let the lower moments discourage you, right? Keep going at it. I think it'll come along, but it may not go as quickly as you think.
If you attended the prior session, then you heard about salons. Salons are an unbelievably powerful process to bring together emerging neutrals, giving them mentorship, collegiality, and certainly the LYRA chapter here in Arizona is going to start not so much with a salon, but introductions to this whole field and trying to explain and educate people as to exactly what this profession is. So I recommend any chapter of LYRA to embrace this as well. But salons are something which we need to do more of, and I think there was a consensus from the last session. So with that, we are very thrilled with all the questions that you've asked. I hope this has been a helpful dialogue on this increasingly important question. I know all of us are the believers on this call. We believe that there is an obligation to develop the next generation of neutrals. So with that, we're going to leave this session, and in 10 minutes or so, the third and final session of the day will occur. Thank you so much.